Chapter 221. Since Madame Vanderbilt has already expressed her opinion, why didn't you take the opportunity to get back Venice shares? Kennedy looked at Maisie incomprehensibly. After all, Stephen would definitely hand the shares to her if she were to mention them to him at this time. Maisie gave off a faint smile. Seoul isn't very stable yet. I'd have to spend more time and energy if I were to get my hands on Vena Jewelry's shares now. It won't pay off. But since my father has promised me not to hand Vena's shares over to Hector, I can naturally rest assured. Since a while back, her relationship with her father had no longer been as rigid as it was before. Although she had once blamed her father for a lot of things, he was still her biological father. Quincy appeared outside the office with a gift box. He knocked on the door first, smiled, and entered the room. Ms. Vanderbilt. Maisie was startled. Her gaze landed on the blue gift box in his hands. What is that? It's a custom-made dress that Mr. Goldman wanted you to have. Mr. Goldman said you should wear it while you meet him tonight. Maisie choked on her saliva and coughed abruptly as her expression turned more and more embarrassed. She remembered that she seemed to have given her word to that insatiable bag in the office yesterday. It seemed that tonight's date was inevitable. At the Grand Courtyard Hotel Steakhouse, Maisie entered the restaurant in a royal blue off-shoulder dress. The ankle-length skirt was draped with a layer of gauze, and the silver tassel earrings swayed from side to side as she stepped forward. She sashayed into Nolan's gaze like an elf who was lost in the woods, and her beauty was breathtaking. Nolan's eyes narrowed as he pressed his thin lips tightly and then opened them slightly. This dress suits you a lot. It exuded a unique temperament when she was wearing it. Nolan was actually a little upset about his decision to get her to wear such a glamorous dress. He really did not want to share her beauty with other men. Fortunately, he had reserved the entire steakhouse. This was Maisie's first time eating out with Nolan. Not to mention that it was in the form of a formal date. Nolan's indifferent and stern features abetted under the dimmed lighting, and his handsome face looked rather charming at this moment. Mr. Goldman is quite generous when it comes to spending money. Huh? Nolan smiled as he cut the steak on his plate gracefully. Well, there's no need for you to be frugal for me. Isn't all my money yours in the future? After all, she belonged exclusively to him now. Maisie glanced away, grabbed the wine glass on the table, and was about to take a sip. But the man frowned slightly and chuckled. Don't get drunk so as not to delay serious business. Maisie's hand trembled, and she put down the wine glass. Mr. Goldman, actually you made a promise yesterday. I won't give you a chance to go back on your words. Nolan's gaze was fixed on her. Maisie was rendered speechless. Nolan then continued. Also, judging from the relationship that we both share now, shouldn't you change the appellation you use to address me? This woman keeps on addressing me as Mr. Goldman while she actually addressed me as Knowles at the Lucas family's mansion the other night. Not to mention the honey that she used at the hotel's entrance. That sounded quite smooth too. The corners of Maisie's lips twitched. Maisie could only hope that the time could go slower and slower throughout the entire meal. But when it got past midnight, she was fascinated by the splendid fireworks outside the window. Nolan got up, walked to her side, and leaned forward with his hands propped on the table. Do you like it? Maisie recovered from the trance. However, maybe it was because of a small amount of wine that she had just drunk. Her heart skipped a beat when she turned her head and rubbed her cheek against his cold lips. Nolan's sexy Adam's apple rolled slightly. That impulse that had been buried at the bottom of his heart surged abruptly, and a beam of fire was ignited in his heart. Chapter 222. Nolan then whispered, I don't want to wait anymore. He lowered his head and kissed her. In the panoramic suite, Nolan placed Maisie on the big round bed covered in rose petals, pressed her down, and kissed her lips passionately and vigorously. The hair scattered on the sides of her neck was fiddling with his heart. How should I punish you? His deep and bold voice intoxicated her heart. "May I?" he whispered in her ear. Maisie was slightly startled as her feelings seemed to have been taken into consideration. Her cheeks blushed in an instant. "Asshole, you're actually shameless enough to ask, Nolan held her waist and could not wait to get all over her, but the cell phone in her purse rang all of a sudden. Maisie's reasoning that had left her long ago was forcibly summoned back into her head by the ringtone. She then pushed his shoulder away. "Nolan, my phone, just let it be." He gnashed his teeth furiously. Who would call at this time to interrupt such an important moment? Are they even human? The phone kept ringing, and Maisie could not help it anymore. She turned over and changed positions with Nolan. Looking at Maisie from this angle, she was extremely enchanting at this moment. Thus, Nolan raised his eyebrows in anticipation. "Do you want to take the lead on this?" Maisie smiled faintly, tied his hand with his tie, and got up to grab the phone. Nolan was rendered speechless. Maisie did not expect her father to call her at this time of the day. "Is it something urgent?" She answered the call, and her father said something to her. Maisie was flustered, and her eyes dimmed. "Okay, then I'll go to the hospital now." She put the phone down, turned her head, and looked at Nolan, who had already freed himself from his restraints. At that moment, his expression looked extremely rigid and annoyed, while his calm emotions were on the brink of a full-on explosion. Maisie took a deep breath and walked to the bedside. "I need to head to the hospital now. As for tonight..." Well, she saw Nolan's agitated expression and wanted to coax him for some reason, so she leaned over and gave him a peck on the lips. The warmth on the lips made Nolan, who was about to lose his cool, grab the back of her head with his big hands, escalate the kiss, and lower his voice reluctantly. "You owe me one." Nolan sent Maisie to the hospital. Maisie got out of the car and was about to walk into the hospital, but Nolan pulled her back. Just when she was still caught in doubts and suspicions, a custom-made suit jacket was draped over her shoulders. And she was wrapped in it. "Put it on." This man, Maisie reached the inpatient ward with Nolan's suit jacket. Madame Vanderbilt had been hit by a car and was hospitalized. Although it had nothing to do with her, Madame Vanderbilt was still her grandmother. Besides, her father had called and summoned her personally. She had to show her face even if she did not want to come to visit. Maisie walked into the ward and frowned instantly when she saw the woman sitting next to the bed. "It's Layla?" Madame Vanderbilt was immediately piqued when she saw Maisie. Especially when she realized that she was wearing a man's suit. "You actually came here dressed like this? Just how shameless can you be?" Maisie smiled indifferently. "Mr. Goldman kindly put it on me for fear that I would catch a cold." "How is this a shameless thing?" Madame Vanderbilt did not say anything when she heard the words Mr. Goldman. She only said to Stephen, "If it weren't for Layla, I would have died this time around. In spite of what she's done, Layla is still my lifesaver. She even injured herself doing so. You have to take your wife at least back, no matter what." Stephen did not say anything. Maisie's eyes turned cold. Layla saved Madame Vanderbilt? Bandages could be seen wrapped around her hand. Layla gave off a smile. "Mother. You don't have to speak for me. I don't deserve to be your daughter-in-law anymore. Just take this as an opportunity for me to pay back the kindness that you and Steph have shown me over the years." Chapter 223. Who told you that you don't deserve it? You've saved my life. That makes you the great benefactor of the Vanderbilts. Madame Vanderbilt was still a little scared at the moment. After all, if Layla had not appeared and pushed her away, she would have probably died underneath the wheels. "Stephen, you're no longer a young lad, so stop thinking about the divorce all day long. Layla has been married to you for so many years. Isn't it just a fake pregnancy? She only wanted to give you a son. Is that wrong?" Madame Vanderbilt glared at Maisie as she was speaking. We're a family, so why make it difficult for a member of your family? The sentence was directed at Maisie. Maisie raised her eyes lightly and smirked. Wow, Grandma. Did you get rescued by Miss Scott just when you were about to run into a car accident? What a coincidence, huh? Layla bit her lip. Damn you, Maisie Vanderbilt. So you're really here to make things hard, huh? Z, I know that you don't like me. But I didn't save your grandmother with any ulterior motive in mind. Anyway, I don't plan to return to the Vanderbilts, nor do I plan to ask for your father's forgiveness. Layla stood up slowly as she spoke. I'd better go back already. What do you mean by going back? Sit back down, Madame Vanderbilt said boldly. The divorce hasn't been finalized yet, has it? You've made such a big fuss out of it. I'll let it slide since C is the ignorant one, but why are you so ignorant too? Stephen, who had remained silent for a long time, looked at Layla and said slowly, you stay with Mother. Layla nodded and sat back down. Seeing that Stephen had left the ward, Maisie left with him. Madame Vanderbilt snorted and grabbed Layla's hand. Don't worry. You'll get to return to the Vanderbilt Manor as long as I'm here. Layla looked virtuous and smiled. Thank you, Mother. Stephen looked at Maisie with a complex expression outside the ward. Z, about Layla, she saved your grandmother, and she now knows that she was wrong. So I plan to give her another chance and let her return to the Vanderbilt Manor. Will you blame me for that? Since her father was going to give Layla a second chance, Maisie's face dimmed. Are you sure about trusting her again? Z. I know you don't like her, Maisie interrupted him lightly. It's not that matter of whether I like her or not. Since this is your decision, then you should just let her return to the manor. As long as you don't trust her blindly once again. It was obvious that her words carried other meanings. Stephen seemed to have gotten the underlying meaning of Maisie's words, but he still chose to believe in Layla again. Maisie did not try to stop him. What Layla had done to win Madame Vanderbilt's heart back in order to return to the manor only showed that her purpose was definitely not as simple as it seemed. She wanted to see what Layla had in mind this time around. Maisie walked out of the hospital. When she saw that Nolan was leaning against the front of his car and was being approached by two women, she raised her hand and rubbed her forehead. Having an eye-catching car isn't a big deal here, but it will be an issue if the man is also extremely eye-catching. Maisie stepped forward. And the two women looked back and saw her walking towards them in a man's coat. They immediately understood something and left hesitantly. Let's go, let's go. It turns out that he's no longer available. That's a pity. Maisie took off Nolan's coat and returned it to him. Why didn't you wait in the car? Nolan crossed his arms, and a smile appeared at the corners of his lips. It's hot in the car, so I've come out to escape from the heat. Maisie pretended that she had not said what she had just said. She had actually felt a little guilty when she saw him standing outside in such a thin shirt. Nolan turned around, pressed her against the car door, and looked at her. Noon will bother you again tonight, am I right? Maisie's eyes looked iffy. It's already so late, so I think. Chapter 224. Nobody knew how Nolan could manage to explain it to her in a serious manner. See, if I were to suffer from any side effects because of holding back all these urges, it would be bad for you, back at the Goldman mansion. Nolan directly carried Maisie upstairs and threw her onto the bed. Maisie pushed his body that was pressing against hers away in a flurry. The kids are home, and this is not optimal, it's okay. They're all asleep. Nolan peeled her clothes off as if she was a cocoon. Then, the hotel room would be wasted. I don't mind that tiny amount of money. Nolan, Maisie's words were shoved back down her throat as he bowed down and sealed her lips. Before Maisie could catch a breather, Nolan suddenly stopped. And the stagnant air in the room felt a little awkward. Nolan stood up and turned his back to her, his handsome face looking a little stiff. Maisie was befuddled for a split second. That's it? She took a sideways glance at Nolan. This breathtaking man that possesses such a superb figure actually has such hidden illnesses? So he really had not touched Willow in the past 6 years. So, what happened between us 6 years ago was really an accident. If this is the case, it is truly unfortunate. However, this is closely related to his dignity as a man. I'm afraid that he'll feel even worse if I don't say anything now. That being the case, since he treats the kid so well, I'll have to treat him better in the future. Nolan, you. Don't worry, even if you have hidden illnesses. I won't despise you for that. I should say something to comfort him at this time, shouldn't I? Everything was fine when she did not say anything. But unfortunately, she did. Nolan's eyes, which were staring at her, turned cold and stern all of a sudden. Are you questioning my ability? Maisie smiled, but before she had the time to say anything, Nolan's body was already crushing down against hers once again. I think I need to be serious now. In the next second, Maisie realized that she was really wrong. This night went on for almost an eternity. The next morning, Maisie opened her eyes faintly, only to find out that her body was sore while her throat felt dry and ached. I shouldn't have said that last night. An arm suddenly hugged her from behind while she was still contemplating her life choices. And as if the man realized that she had woken up, a deep and pleasant voice sounded. You've awakened? Maisie trembled from head to toe. This man is getting greedier as time goes by. And he just won't get tired of it. It was already in the early evening when Maisie went back to the company again. She wore a black turtleneck to cover the hickeys on her neck. And when she arrived at the studio, she saw a tall man standing in front of the jewelry display window as if he was waiting for someone. Maisie was then flustered when the man turned around. Isn't this, Mr. Lucas? Maisie sat on the sofa and glanced at him with her arms crossed. So, did Mrs. Lucas ask you to come to me? Louis took his teacup and took a sip from it. He then replied with a calm expression, consider it a yes. My mother wants to see you. I know you've been reluctant to meet her because of that affair related to Willow Vanderbilt. So I've chosen to come to you. I told you that I don't want my Dahama identity. My last name is Vanderbilt, but I heard that you don't admit that you're one of the Vanderbilts either. Your relationship with the Vanderbilts isn't as close as you make it seem. Am I right? Louis asked nonchalantly. Maisie paused and raised her gaze. Even if my relationship with the Vanderbilts is bad, it doesn't change the fact that I'm a Vanderbilt. Actually, it doesn't matter if you want to accept your identity as one of the Armas or not. Louis put down the teacup and continued slowly. Grandfather just wants to reunite with his granddaughter. When you want to know more about your mother, please do contact me. You think about it. Louis said so while putting his business card on the desk. Maisie took a glance at the logo on the business card. He's actually a professor at the Royal Academy of Music? Chapter 225. At the hospital. Layla came out of the ward with her cell phone and went to the stairwell to make a call. Willie, don't worry. Grandma already trusts me. I'll get your dad to go pick you up as soon as I get to go back to Vanderbilt Manor. Wait. How much longer do I have to wait? I don't want to stay here anymore. Willow hated living in a cheap rental house. Had I known this would happen back then, I wouldn't have irritated Dad like that. At least, living in the Vanderbilt Manor is much better than this shabby place. Sensing that Willow was extremely grumpy, Layla said patiently. I know, Willie, revenge is a dish best served cold. As long as we can bear it, there will always be a way to deal with that bitch. You should know that that bitch now has the information about my life, before I became Mrs. Vanderbilt. Both of us will really suffer if we fail again this time around. Willow could only calm herself down no matter how anxious she was upon hearing what her mother said. Okay. I'll bear it then. Maisie, that bitch, I'll definitely give her hell when Mom brings me back to the Vanderbilt Manor. At the Black Gold Group. Nolan was going through a contract, but his mind was not on the contract's content at all. He stared at one of the pages for a long time. Quincy, who was standing on the side, looked at Nolan's restless face and curled his lips. Mr. Goldman, are you waiting for the contract to bear fruits by itself? Quincy looked at the flaunting bite mark on Nolan's neck. It seemed that all men who had just gone through an open season would give off such an aura. Nolan tapped the contract with his slender fingertips, recalling the sweet memory from last night. How could his young wife be so gorgeous and memorable? Quincy looked worried. It's over for him. He's gone cuckoo after just one night's worth of intimacy. Quincy's phone rang at this time, and he checked the caller ID. It's Hans. Nolan raised his gaze to look at him. Quincy walked to the side to answer the call. After the person on the phone said something to him, Quincy gasped and turned around to look at Nolan. Mr. Goldman, the Elder Master has suddenly changed his itinerary and is going to travel here a week in advance. Nolan's eyes narrowed slightly. That fast? Layla was taking care of Madame Vanderbilt in the hospital. And her uncomplaining attitude changed Madame Vanderbilt's attitude toward her gradually. Layla, hasn't Stephen called you to return home yet? Seeing that Madame Vanderbilt had asked her about it, Layla stopped the task on hand and smiled. Whether Steph is willing to allow me to go back, I'll leave the decision to him. Humph, it's all because of that slut, Maisie. Madame Vanderbilt thought that Maisie must be the culprit who was behind all these issues, and said with dissatisfaction. How could she be so lucky if she hadn't gotten together with Mr. Goldman? Layla savored Madame Vanderbilt's disgust toward Maisie, felt smug inwardly, thought of something, and said, Mother, there's something that I want to tell you. Just give it to me directly. I'm sorry, Mother. The reason I faked my pregnancy was not that I didn't want to get a divorce with Steph. You should also know how Steph has been acting recently. He'll definitely hand Venna to Z soon. So if I don't bear a son, judging from Steph's attitude toward Z, the Vanderbilts will surely suffer in the future. Layla had always been good at disguising herself as a victim, and the kindness that she had been showing was nothing more than a tool to make Madame Vanderbilt feel that she had always been thinking about the Vanderbilts' benefits. Madame Vanderbilt recalled something upon hearing this. Stephen had not listened to her words yesterday, so how could she still stay calm? You're right, Venna belongs to the Vanderbilts. Even if Marina founded the company, it's still the Vanderbilts' property. Madame Vanderbilt's expression dimmed. It seems that whore is really planning to snatch Venna from the Vanderbilts. Humph, over my dead body. Chapter 226. Maisie had to find a way to stop it soon. At Soul Jewelry Studio. The other people in the department gradually left for the day. Nolan got to Maisie's office and leaned on the door with his arms crossed while watching Maisie look for some documents in front of the book rack. He couldn't move his eyes away from this beauty before him. Maisie didn't notice someone approaching her. She was searching with her head down, but felt something move closer behind her. The man hugged her from behind and made Maisie jump. She didn't turn around to see who it was. Nolan. Why are you, what? I just want to give you a hug. The man's voice sniggered from the top of her head. Why couldn't he let go of this woman? Maisie took a deep breath and remembered what had happened the night before. Her cheeks burned up. Maisie felt a little ashamed. But she wasn't going to admit that she couldn't resist his charm last night. It's time to fetch Colton from school. Nolan lowered his head and put his chin on her shoulder. The warmth of his breath made her ears turn red. Maisie pushed him away. There's no need to get so close. Nolan looked down and smiled, holding her waist closer with his palm. Maisie laughed. Nolan was probably the most shameless person she had ever met. Even if Nolan was feeling gracious after letting her off in the office. When they were picking Colton up from the Royal Academy of Music, Colton stared at his neck for the longest time. Daddy, did something bite your neck? Maisie looked over in shock. The hickey on his neck was still there. Nolan looked at Maisie through the corner of his eyes. When Maisie tried to avoid his gaze, he smiled and said, "That's not for kids to know." "Uncle Quincy, what happened to Daddy's neck?" Since he didn't get an answer from his father, he switched to asking Quincy instead. Quincy wouldn't ever dare to tell him the truth. He shuddered and laughed. "You wouldn't understand." Angela sent Waylon and Daisy back to the Goldman mansion. They were in a drama series alongside Helios. Daisy played his daughter while Waylon was cast as the younger version of him. Maisie didn't agree with them getting into the industry at first, but she was more laid back since they didn't give her any trouble. Nolan wasn't happy when he heard that his daughter was acting as Helios' daughter. It felt like his favorite blanket had been taken by someone else. Colton was still wondering what had happened to his father's neck. Nolan never missed a chance to attack Maisie over the past few days. When Maisie got to Seoul Studio, she went to the washroom to cover up the mark on her neck. That man had too much energy. She couldn't face her kids like that. The phone on the desk rang. Maisie put the concealer into her bag and answered when she saw that Steven was calling. "Dad? Z, your grandma has been discharged from the hospital. Your uncle is coming over. Come back and have dinner with us today." At the Vanderbilt Manor. Layla made tea for Yanis because she was the younger sister-in-law. Yanis looked down on Layla, who had started as a mistress. However, when she heard from Madame Vanderbilt that Layla was on their side, she didn't treat her too badly. Chapter 227. Layla, I heard that you've been taking care of Mom for the past few days at the hospital. Layla smiled. It's what a daughter-in-law is supposed to do. Yorick looked at Layla and couldn't deny that his brother had great taste. He compared her to his own wife, who was rough around the edges. She had let herself go after childbirth and looked like a tired wife. Even though Layla was no longer young, she still looked young and beautiful. Yanis' face changed upon noticing the way her husband was looking at Layla. She cleared her throat, which got Yorick's notice and made him smile awkwardly. He changed the topic. By the way, where are Willie and Z? Madame Vanderbilt said to Steven, "Yes, Willie is your daughter. We should ask her to join us for dinner." Layla was glad about what Madame Vanderbilt said, but she didn't show it. When Steven thought about Willow, it really had been a while since he had seen her. No matter what she had done, she was still his daughter. Get Layla to ask her over. After Steven agreed, Layla smiled and said, "I'll call Willie then." Maisie was the last to show up when the Vanderbilts were having a great time at the dinner table. After Willow saw Maisie looking even more radiant than before and remembered how tough her life had been, she resented her even more. Steven smiled and said, seeing the empty seat next to him, "Z, come sit next to me." Madame Vanderbilt wasn't too happy about that. "That's the seat of your wife, Layla. You're letting your daughter sit there instead of her?" Layla, who was seated elsewhere, said, "It's all right, Mother. Let Z take it." Maisie sat down next to her father. Yorick smiled and said, "You turned out beautiful." Yanis mocked. "Sure, praise your sister-in-law's daughter." He had praised Willow before that and now Maisie. However, he never said anything good about his daughter. Maisie's lips curled. "Thanks for your compliment. I remember that Lynn is getting prettier too. Why isn't she here?" Maisie's words made Yanis and Madame Vanderbilt's expressions change. How dare she ask? Yorick felt a little awkward too. He had sent his daughter to the Zimmerman kid and was waiting to see if she was able to marry into the family. His daughter was nothing compared to the two nieces from the city. "Yorick, you're out all thanks to Z." Steven spoke to break the awkward silence while reminding his brother to remember what Z did. Before Yorick could speak, Madame Vanderbilt intervened. "What do you mean all thanks to her? It was all Mr. Goldman's doing. Stephen frowned. Mom. Why would Mr. Goldman help if it weren't for Z? Have you forgotten your granddaughter's help? Furthermore, I was the one who asked Z to help. Madame Vanderbilt was put in a tough spot after being humiliated by her son. This son of hers really had lost her respect. No. Perhaps they were never close, to begin with. Maisie curiously looked at her father, who spoke up for her. Had he not seen past Layla and Willow's facades, he wouldn't have spoken up for her. Chapter 228. Maisie scanned the table discreetly, thinking Madame Vanderbilt was discharged. Yorick and Yanis came over to Basberg, and even Layla and Willow are back at the Vanderbilt mansion. It doesn't seem like a simple dinner. The air was tense, because everyone had their own motives in mind. Yanis looked at Maisie and asked, Z, I heard you've started your own jewelry studio. How's it doing? It sounded like she asked for a reason and not because she cared. Madame Vanderbilt chimed in, of course, she's doing well. Mr. Goldman is helping her. It wouldn't be too bad. She can live a good life even if she does nothing. Mr. Goldman? Yorick was surprised that his niece had caught a big one. Yes, Z brought honor to the family. All thanks to that pretty face of hers, Madame Vanderbilt said sarcastically. All Maisie knew was how to be flirty. Sensing the sarcasm, Maisie beamed and curled her lips. Yes, it's all thanks to the face that my mother gave me. Neither Willow nor Linda was able to get his attention. It seems like you're disappointed because they weren't able to help with their faces? Willow wanted to lash out, but Layla held her back, hinting that she shouldn't be impulsive. Stephen was slowly starting to open up to them again. If he got angry, they would never get to return to the manor. Madame Vanderbilt scoffed and dropped all pretense. You have your own studio and Mr. Goldman's help. Why not give Venna to your cousin? Yanis agreed with her. The girl was the reason they were in their current state. What would be wrong if their son inherited their uncle's company? Yes, Stephen. You don't have a son. Venna should be passed down to a Vanderbilt. Why don't you give it to Hector? He's family, after all. Huh. Before Stephen could say anything, Maisie laughed out loud. When my mom and dad founded Venna, no one from the Vanderbilts chipped in. Now that your businesses are closed down, you're trying to take away Venna shamelessly? Z, how could you say that? Was I wrong? Maisie looked at Yanis sternly. The so-called family never helped when we needed it but instead tried to guilt-trip my father to share what he has. That's not going to happen. Z, how could you speak before your father even said something? My dad was quiet because he respects his mother. But that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. Maisie cut off Madame Vanderbilt without skipping a beat. That's all I'm going to say for today. I'm not giving Venna to anyone. Come and take it if you can. But you will need to be capable enough to do that. Madame Vanderbilt and Yanis looked worse by the minute. They weren't afraid of Maisie. They were afraid of the man behind her. If they were to take it by force, it wouldn't end well for them. Layla remained on the fence. She neither joined in nor spoke, but what Stephen said next changed the expression of everyone present. Chapter 229. That's right. I will only give Venna to Z. Only my daughter is worthy. Stephen seemed to have understood that they were trying to force him to hand over the shares of Venna Jewelry. If that were the case, there would be no need to wait. I've gotten lawyers to put Z's name as the beneficiary of Venna. Have you gone mad? Why would you give it to her? What did you contribute when Marina and I started Venna? Stephen looked at Madame Vanderbilt and scoffed. Mom, I respect you. But since you've never treated me like your son or saw Z as your granddaughter, there's reason to be courteous anymore. How Madame Vanderbilt shook with rage, but the words were stuck in her throat. The dinner ended coldly. When Yanis and Yorick left, almost no one noticed the signals Yorick sent to Layla. Unfortunately, Maisie was walking at the back and did notice them. When she walked past Layla, she smiled and said, "Be careful not to get burned if you play with fire." The words made Layla's heart turn cold. She squared her jaw and thought that she would never feel better if she didn't get rid of this woman. Nolan was reading some documents in the study until Quincy sent him a message. The Vanderbilts from Karelia are trying to steal the rights of Venna from Maisie? Who gave them the guts to do that? He had looked into them long ago. Other than Stephen, who was considered normal, the rest of Madame Vanderbilt's children were no good. Madame Vanderbilt had a very traditional and patriarchal way of thinking. It was obvious how she treated her two sons. Yorick had a son whom Madame Vanderbilt had spoiled since he was a kid. Now he was just a useless man who sat around and waited to be fed. They really were dreaming to even think of handing Venna to a useless man. "Daddy." The three musketeers popped their heads in. Nolan put down the documents and squinted at them while they jumped on him. He held Daisy in his arms and patted Waylon and Colton's heads. "What's up, you three?" Colton said, "Daddy, Mommy just got back from the Vanderbilt Manor and is not happy." Waylon said, "Did the Vanderbilts bully her?" Daisy said, "They're such horrible people." Nolan looked at the three upset rugrats. They were so young, yet they were worrying for the adults already. He smiled. "Do you think anyone can get to bully your mother?" The three nodded hesitantly. Their mother wasn't easy to bully, but she still was. "Daddy, you're not going to do anything? Your wife is getting bullied." Colton squinted. Nolan paused and laughed. "Do you think your mommy is going to let me intervene? Your daddy is the man behind your mommy. I'm not going to let people take advantage of her." The three nodded hesitantly again. That seemed to make sense. Daisy played with Nolan's tie. All she heard was the man behind her. Something popped up in her mind, and she tilted her head and asked, "The man behind her? Daddy, does that mean you're living off of her?" Colton asked, curiously, "What does that mean?" Waylon and Daisy said in unison, "It means he's a deadbeat who relies on his wife to feed him." Chapter 230. Nolan was rendered speechless. What would the man who killed it in the business world be afraid of? The answer was his wife getting angry. Now his biggest fear was that his children would have unique ideas about him. He was going to get a heart attack. Maisie spoke to someone on the phone on the balcony. The other party said something and Maisie looked down. "Thanks, Mr. Zidane. Please don't tell my father about this." The person on the other end said something back and Maisie nodded. "All right. We'll speak tomorrow then." Maisie put down her phone and looked coldly into the night view. She had seen what was the agenda behind dinner that night. Even if her dad insisted on being on her side, it was weak compared to how hungry Madame Vanderbilt and Yorick's family were. If they could not make Stephen hand over Venna's ownership, they would be thinking about taking it by force soon. And then there was Layla and Willow. Layla was clever enough not to be on the wrong side this time around because she had something of theirs. Even though she couldn't be sure if Layla was working with them, Maisie seemed to have caught something interesting. A pair of arms suddenly grabbed her waist. She was wearing thin clothing. Her cool body was suddenly warmed by the body that was hugging her from behind. "Aren't you tired of facing the entire family by yourself? Why didn't you just bring me along?" Nolan sounded a little hurt. If his face didn't remain the same, and his identity was never changed, she would suspect whether he was an imposter. "There's no need for your help yet." Maisie turned to look at him. That beautiful face of his looked even better without his usual stemness and coldness. No, why did she think that he looked even better? Nolan ran his finger over her lips, narrowed his eyes, and said, "Just do what you have to. I'll take care of the rest." Maisie paused and avoided his gaze. "I know, but can you Her lips were sealed. He seemed to have guessed what she was going to say. He didn't want to be serious. It's time to sleep, the man whispered and carried her toward the bed. Seeing how his hands were wandering, Maisie blushed. Nolan, you said to sleep, he was always the one in control. The night was just as crazy as any other night. The next day, Maisie met with Mr. Zidane at a cafe. The lawyer had prepared an equity transfer agreement for her. When she saw that it matched the agreement her father had made, she was content. Ms. Vanderbilt, why would you need this agreement? He didn't understand why Maisie would want to make a fake agreement. Maisie looked at him. I have my use for it. I might be able to help my father see through a few people. No matter what methods they used, she would be more relaxed knowing there was a copy of the agreement. She remembered something and smiled. Mr. Zidane. There's something else I need your help with. Mr. Zidane paused and nodded. All right, tell me. Layla hadn't returned home the previous night. When she got home and saw Stephen, she avoided his gaze. Layla, where were you last night? Stephen finally agreed for you and Willow to return. But you didn't stay over. Madame Vanderbilt wasn't happy that Layla had been cut.